Good morning, YouTube. Wobbles on a lot here. Sunday, 2nd of April, just getting ready for the round table discussion.
The coalition government finally managing to get company tax cuts through the Senate, struck a deal with the Nick Xenophon team. Labor attacked the government for putting big business ahead of battling workers, supporting cuts to penalty rates, opposing a rise in the minimum wage. So this week on the Sunday Roundtable, we thought we'd ask who's right and who's wrong on the jobs front. Are high wages keeping the unemployed out of work? And will cuts to company taxes, will that bring in foreign investment, which will in turn generate jobs and higher wages? Tim Lyons is a research fellow at the progressive think tank Per Capita and a former ACTU Assistant Secretary. G'day, Tim. G'day, Tom. Judith Sloan is an economist and contributing editor at The Australian. Nice to chat with you again, Judith.
It's a pleasure, Tom.
And Kate Carnell is the Australian Small Business and Family Enterprise Ombudsman. G'day, Kate.
Hi, Tom.
Thanks so much for being here. Now, question, were we surprised by the decision of the Fair Work Commission's decision? This one on penalty rates. First to you, Kate.
Look, I don't suppose we were that surprised. The Fair Work Commission had been looking at this for 2 years. They'd taken 6,000 submissions. They'd had about 140 people give evidence and be cross-examined and so on. So a lot of evidence was put on the table. And I suppose the argument from the business sector was that penalty rates on Sunday should become the same as Saturday. That was their argument. And the unions, of course, said there should be no change. The Fair Work Commission came down somewhere in the middle of that. So they reduced Sunday a bit, but not as far as Saturday. And the Fair Work Commission has a tendency to take that approach. If they think there's evidence on the table, they tend to go to a sort of a position somewhere in the middle. They do that on minimum wages and other things. So they thought there was evidence to suggest that Sundays had changed in the way we deal with them as a community, that people expected businesses to be open on Sundays, and so they came up with a position in between the two parties.
Tim, Fair Work Commission, Labor creation, was this decision on penalty rates the right one in your view?
No, I don't think so, Tom. And one thing about what Kate just said, in fact, the earliest applications by employers to kind of reduce the Sunday penalty rate started in about 2010, actually. And so there's been an attempt by retail and hospitality employers in particular over a very long period. And I think partly what happened in the end is the Fair Work Commission kind of gave in and gave them part of what they asked for. But I was surprised because the actual evidence that was led by the employers about the likely positive effects, in their view, of cuts to people's wages on a Sunday were actually very, very skinny. And there wasn't a lot of evidence about job creation. There wasn't a lot of evidence about extra hours. There was a lot of sort of histrionics and a lot of claims about what this would make, but the actual evidence that was led was pretty skinny. So I was surprised that they effectively gave in to that application.
Well, Judith, before the decision came down, the Prime Minister, he said he was going to stand by the umpires on Sunday penalty rates. How do you think the government's handled this so far?
I think quite badly. I, by the way, don't agree with Tim. I think if you were following the case closely, it was pretty clear what was going to happen. These are ridiculously anachronistic penalty rates, which were put there, particularly take the case of retail, at the time when we had extremely restricted trading hours. So this didn't really matter because no one was able to be open on a Sunday. So the fact that, an extremely high penalty rate sat there in the water was just a sort of theory. So I think the government was caught, and I kind of blame the bureaucracy and the advisors in the sense that I don't think he was warned enough that this was a likely outcome, and therefore he had to have his hymn sheet completed, really, in terms of the argument. And I think it took him quite a long time to get a sort of compelling economic narrative going.
Yeah, well, Labor, Tim, has put through legislation to overturn the decision. I suppose it gets back to precedent. To what extent is that a dangerous precedent? Because the coalition would argue it undermines the independence and authority then of the Fair Work Commission. Is that a fair point?
Oh, look, you do have to be careful in your approach to this, but I think some of the commentary on this has been a bit over the top because it's fairly routine, in fact, for parliaments, both at a state and federal level, where there's an outcome of a court or tribunal decision which they consider to be inconsistent with the policy intention, where retrospectively the legislation is changed. State governments do that about things like planning law or criminal law all the time, and so it's an entirely legitimate thing for the Parliament to do, to say, look, there's been this decision of an independent tribunal. We don't think that's consistent with the public interest, so we're going to alter the legislation so that in future a specific policy intent is implemented. I don't think that undermines the independence or integrity of the Commission at all, provided it's done in a sensible fashion. And I think if there's a parliamentary majority that supports the position of weekend rates, then the Parliament's entitled to take that step. Yeah, Judith?
Well, I mean, it's either independent or it's not.
Yeah.
And that, they're not actually saying in the future, they're actually trying to overturn actual decisions. So, to talk about state planning law stuff is absolutely irrelevant. This would be...
Well, why doesn't the analogy hold, Judith?
This would be a volcano. I mean, this was set up by the Labor government to be independent, to make its decisions on the basis of submissions put to it, and the unions had their go, and the employers had their go, and the governments had their go and stuff. And this has been the basis of this institution in various forms for over 100 years. And all of a sudden, the Labor Party says, "Oh well, we don't like that decision." I mean, it will create chaos, I think, because then some other government gets in and say, "Well, we don't like that decision on something else." So either it's independent or it's not. Bill Shorten was very keen to confirm his support of the Fair Work Commission up until the time that they reached a decision he didn't like.
Yeah, before I go to Kate, Tim respond to that, but you could argue that both sides of Parliament, I mean, isn't there a danger here that they won't stand by the umpire's decision? Well, they only will when it suits them.
Yep, that's what it does.
Well, I think, but you've got a specific issue here, and I mean, you mentioned the politics of this and why the government actually ended up in trouble. I mean, the government is defending a position that says that the solution to some of Australia's problems is lower pay for some people. Now, that is just pure political poison. It's not something that's supported by the majority of people. In fact, about 2/3 of Australians actually support things like penalty rates and weekend rates, including fairly large chunks of Liberal voters. I mean, the government is left here defending a position which is not supported by the community.
That's just not true. Sorry.
Well,
that's what the polling evidence shows.
The fact that Pauline Hanson has done a big about-face on this, Kate, does that indicate that it's politically very dangerous?
Look, it's a politically difficult issue, but look, let's be fair. The unions have negotiated away penalty rates or reduced penalty rates on Sundays and public holidays for years in EBAs. They've done that and, in fact, reduced penalty rates on Sundays and public holidays significantly more than this particular decision actually does. So what we've got at the moment is penalty rates on Sundays and public holidays are significantly lower for the big end of town, for the Coles, the Woolworths, the McDonald's, the Domino's. So they're paying lower penalty rates on Sundays and public holidays. So the people who are paying these higher rates are the small businesses, the mum and dad people who can't, who simply EBAs are out of their reach. So let's look at a bit of fairness and equity here.
Well, let's turn to
Tom, I do need to actually just pick that up because, I mean, this has been run consistently by Kate.
Because it's true.
Those agreements almost universally provide for much higher base rates of pay than provided for by the award. So there's been an arrangement where the rates for Sunday have been, in some cases, rolled into base rates. So, that is not an apples with apples comparison. I understand why that's used as a political point, but
it
this
still
idea of there being
Sunday penalty rates for people who only work on Sundays.
And this idea that there's some direct competition.
Well, let's move on to the minimum wage because let's bear in mind that penalty rates is one of three things we want to talk about this morning. The minimum wage is a big issue too in Canberra this week. The Fair Work Commission must now make a decision on it. So, back to you, Tim. Given the ACTU got half the raise they asked for last year, do you think they'll be happy to get half this claim again?
No, I don't think they'll be happy to get half this claim again. I mean, we've had essentially since 1990, the relative value of our minimum wages against median wages has been falling. It's fallen from about 2/3 of median wages to about 55% of median wages. And bear in mind that 2/3 of median wages is the OECD's definition of low pay. So we now have a national minimum wage which is well below the level that is internationally defined as being low pay. Now, there was never any sort of overarching decision that put us in a position where we were going to cut the relative value of the minimum wage. What that does is reduce the relative living standards of Australia's lowest paid. We've had essentially 8 consecutive years of falling rates of wage increases in the economy as a whole. Australia actually has a problem with wage growth. We need some more of it. A very good place to start is right at the bottom, not only for equity and fairness reasons, because that starts to put some upward wage pressure on the rest of the economy. At a time when growth is okay, profits are pretty good, unemployment is not too bad, this is a good opportunity to put some purchasing power back into the bottom of the labour market.
Well, Kate, back to you. Will employer groups and small business be satisfied with only double the raise they asked for?
Look, really, there's no doubt that the minimum wage should, in my view, increase with inflation. So it shouldn't go down in real terms. We've got to understand that a minimum wage in Australia is amongst the highest in the world, and in fact, in the top 2 or 3 in the world. So that's the reality here. So it should keep in line with inflation. Inflation is low at the moment, there's no doubt about that. And if you put it up at a greater rate than inflation or the cost of living, then what you're saying to the 3 million small businesses that turn over under $10 million a year is that you guys are going to pay for this. It's going to come out of your profit, out of your businesses, because your growth is usually pretty much in line with inflation. So what it does is it impacts upon small businesses, means that they've got less money to invest or to employ people in their business. It's really that simple.
Well, Judith, let us put it back to you then. I mean, if you keep the minimum wage low, could that be a disincentive to people finding employment? Because, people might argue that high travel, childcare costs, if wages are too low, it makes it financially unviable to work. How would you respond to that argument?
Well, don't forget the actual minimum wage is covered by a relatively small number of people actually in that. So when we're talking about this, and this is in fact I think a very significant criticism of the whole system, is that in virtually every other developed country they adjust the minimum wage, meaning that the wage paid to the lowest paid. We're actually adjusting the over 2 million workers who are on award wages, up to $160,000 a year. So it's a very bizarre system. I mean, look, I think this is just part of the theatre. $45, yeah, no, well, they're not going to get that. They may get, I think, slightly closer to $20, but it's interesting that the government submission uses the term cautious. And indeed, if you ever bother to look at the dreary, boring decisions that the Fair Work Commission comes out, they're cautious too. I mean, one of the big features of the labour market at the moment is the growing incidence of underemployment. So this is people who have not enough hours of work to align with their preferences. Now, the last thing you want to do is be giving an above average, above a greater than expected wage increase, because that will actually create an incentive for employers to even further refine the number of hours they need rather than expand it. So I'm sure that will all be taken into account in the decision.
Now, Tim, many folks have highlighted the relatively high minimum wage in Australia, but and many free market economists, the business community, the AFR, the Financial Review editorial page, they'd say that is stopping the unemployed, and underemployed from getting more work. How would you respond to that criticism?
Well, this is always the traditional line, I suppose, and the trouble is both the academic evidence and the experience from the real world doesn't suggest that's true. So essentially every year, and I used to be responsible for this case for many years at the ACTU, the employer associations would make a submission that says if there's an increase in the minimum wage, it will have this catastrophic effect on employment. The minimum wage would be increased by a relatively modest amount, and you'd come back the next year and there would be no detectable negative employment effects. So the reality is you can increase the minimum wage. It is a very good mechanism for equity. It's a very good mechanism to put some purchasing power at the bottom of the labour market. And in essence, there is, generally speaking, no detectable employment effects. And there's been some international experience more recently which has demonstrated that as well. Germany actually brought in a minimum wage for the first time only a few years ago. They set
Okay, here we come to the end of part one. Back immediately.